What's up, students? Going to be bringing you your second lecture from our Unit 3. And we've been dealing with the early American Republic, okay? Just as a broad theme, right? And within that, we're getting into these two really big topics of Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy. Now, when I was an undergraduate at Arkansas Tech, that was an upper level course in the history department, okay? So that's one thing for you to remark on. Now, I'm going to be getting into Jefferson's first term in office. It's a very broad, dense period of history, and there is a lot just within the Thomas Jefferson era. He himself could be an entire upper level course. Just a reminder of the sources for you to check out on Jefferson. The Sally Hemings documentary, that's a great one. I rewatched it again recently. We'll be talking with you about that in a different lecture. Then you've got the Ken Burns, which I'm going to recite a quote from that documentary. Part 2 of that documentary gets into Thomas Jefferson as the president. Part 1 sort of deals with his earlier life before taking the executive office. So some things that we'll be talking about will be the Louisiana Purchase, Corps of Discovery, the Lewis and Clark Expedition. We'll be talking about Marbury versus Madison, a landmark Supreme Court case, and getting into the history of the Supreme Court. So Jefferson's very, very rich history, okay? I want you guys to be sure that you listen to the Constitution New Republic lecture, to really go into Jefferson a lot on the tail end of that lecture, like the last hour. And it's a longer lecture, so you might need to fast forward. So Chapter 7, the Jeffersonian era in the Brinkley textbook. This chapter has a lot of different topics. We talked about the stirrings of industrialism and rise of cultural nationalism in the first lecture. This lecture will deal specifically with Jefferson's first term in office, which will be 1801 to 1805. All right, I'm going to get into kind of start with his inauguration, but want to do a little recap. Now, at Jefferson's inauguration, a quote I will read in more in depth, but it's kind of along with the heading in my notes, is "We're all Republicans. We're all Federalists." Right? So you remember the heated disputes and back and forth between Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington's cabinet, and between Jefferson and Adams administration. So there's been this rising feud between Republicans and Federalists, and that's the sort of the emergence of political parties in the United States. Now, that is one thing that we will discuss, is when Jefferson wins the presidency, the Republicans become very ascendant, okay? Now, here is a quote I want to share with you just from the Thomas Jefferson Ken Burns documentary. This is from Part 2, which you should watch to go along with this, along with, read your textbook, or I recently completed a book on the First Barbary War, which I'll talk with you about in a moment. But here's a quote from the Ken Burns documentary. "Revered as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the most sacred document in American history, yet condemned as a lifelong owner of slaves, Thomas Jefferson remains the enigma that is America." Ken Burns, Thomas Jefferson, Part 2. And I want you to think about Jefferson as this enigmatic type of character as we move forward talking about him, and as you, if you're taking the course, if you're answering questions in relation to this topic, okay? Now, remember, in 1800, you had the election, or the Revolution of 1800, which saw the Republican or Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson square off against the incumbent president and Federalist John Adams. Now, Jefferson had been vice president for Adams. And Jefferson is elected in 1800, takes office in 1801, and will serve 2 terms. Now, we talked about some of this things surrounding the election of 1800, so I'm not going to go super in depth on that, but we got into that in the tail end of that Constitution New Republic lecture. If you recall, Aaron Burr serves as his vice president. Burr is a soldier. He's a lawyer. He's a politician. Burr is also the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. And son of the president of Princeton. He's orphaned early on. As a soldier, he had served in the American Revolution in the Quebec campaign. He also was a spy in the Revolution. Now, Burr proposed allowing women to vote, and he also proposed abolishing slavery. He's known for going door to door, campaigning, and what happens is he runs and comes in 4th for president in the election of 1800. I'm sorry. He came in 4th in the 1796 election. In the 1800 election, he received the 2nd largest number of electoral votes. And because the way that presidency is set up at that time, Burr becomes Jefferson's vice president. Okay, so Jefferson never trusted Burr, though, and goes on to pass the 12th Amendment. So basically, president and vice president will run on a ticket together moving forward, and the presidents can pick their own running mates in elections in the future. Now, Jefferson had lost a previous election to John Adams, 1796, and had ended up his vice president along the same lines. So that is when the two people who were Adams and Jefferson, they were previously friends, but they grew apart during the time that Jefferson is on his administration. And part of that is because of political differences of opinion, but also a great in part by the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed by the Adams administration. And now there's controversy in the election of 1800 that comes up again surrounding Jefferson being a deist. Okay, Adams and his supporters, along in relation to that topic, accused Jefferson of burning Bibles. Okay, now this comes out of the election of 1800. Okay, Jefferson is accused of having a relationship with a slave he owns, named Sally Hemings, right? He is also accused of having fathered multiple children with her. Now, I will get into this, and there's a fantastic documentary that I've included in the Blackboard shell that you can check out that I watched when I was in college. And I mean, it's really good, but I'm going to go into detail on this topic, and I would encourage anyone listening to this to research about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson and that controversy, as it is often called by scholars. So Jefferson's wife had died in the 1780s, and Jefferson carried a lock of her hair with him for the rest of his life. So, but he did have apparently this relationship with Sally Hemings, and this comes up in the election of 1800, and I will go into more detail on that. It actually comes up in 1802, but it's kind of a full circle issue. So, after the House of Representatives and Alexander Hamilton swung the Federalist votes in favor of Jefferson in 1800, Adams and Jefferson have a falling out. Okay, and I will remark on that as we move forward. Let's get into talking about Thomas Jefferson as president. Okay, 1 month from his 58th birthday, March 4th, 1801, Jefferson visits the Senate chambers and took the oath, and becomes the 3rd president of the United States. This is one of the only parts at the time of the brand new Capitol building that was completed. Okay. Now, Federalist John Adams, he's very bitter about Jefferson winning and about the Republicans that are going to be appointed in governmental positions due to Jefferson's approach. So on his way out, Adams appoints a lot of federal judges who are going to oppose Jefferson from the judiciary. Okay, so these guys have once been great friends, and now they've gone to this sort of feud where they are sabotaging one another at the cost of the country, essentially, right? Pitting the different departments against each other. So now Adams does not attend Jefferson's inauguration. He leaves Washington, D.C. Before dawn the day of, and they do not speak to one another again until 1812. After that point, they do have some correspondence between 1812 and 1826. And ironically, they both die July 4th, 1826. Jefferson passing first, Adams dying angry, thinking that Jefferson is still alive. Now, Jefferson stayed the night before his inauguration in the boarding house. It's common. There are a lot of boarding houses nearby or in the D.C. area. And this is very commonly where congressmen would stay when Congress is in session. Now, Jefferson goes to his inauguration dressed in a plain suit and tie. He walked, and he wore shoes that tied because he considered buckles on shoes to be very undemocratic. Now, Jefferson... he presented himself in a manner of Republican simplicity and virtue, right? He just had this absence of pomp, as one scholar puts it, in a very great sense of dignity, right? Now, his inaugural is very softly spoken address. Many people who were there could not understand what he was saying until they read it in a newspaper. I'm going to read a quote that I mentioned earlier. "Let us then, fellow citizens, united with one heart and one mind, let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection with which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it." Okay, so this is an ironic point. You have Jefferson, this sort of strict construction of the Constitution, advocate of decentralized government his whole life, now the head of the country. He is now the head of the, he is now in centralized power. He is centralized power. He is the head of the chief executive of a country. And it's an interesting point. So Jefferson moved into the presidential mansion, as it's called at this time, and declared it big enough for 2 emperors, 1 pope, the Grand Lama in the bargain, and the Grand Lama in the bargain. Now, Jefferson had this conscious effort to make the presidency appear less aristocratic. Washington and Adams had both had these very decadent, as Jefferson deemed it, approaches to leading and very, very elaborate and aristocratic administration. So he wanted to do some things to kind of reverse that. He barred the use of his face on coins. He forbid anyone from celebrating his birthday. He opened the doors of the executive mansion to anyone who wanted to see it. And to many people that saw Jefferson, he appeared somewhat as a servant. Now, Jefferson acted very quickly to undo the actions of the Adams administration. Okay, in a variety of ways. I'm going to overview. It was his hope to reduce the size of the federal government overall while in office. So first thing, he overturns the Alien and Sedition Acts, pardons people who had been jailed under the Sedition Act, returned monies paid in fines, and wrote letters of apology on behalf of the government. One of these individuals is James Callender. And Callender is a newspaper man that was jailed for a year. And he is going to be who turns on, he was hired by Jefferson, he's going to be who turns on Jefferson on this Hemmings controversy. Now, Jefferson did cut federal spending. He reduced the size of the Navy, and this he sabotages himself by doing that, because there's going to be a naval war, and there's going to be a lot of naval battles that will happen in the first Barbary War, but also moving forward. If you can recall, during the Adams administration, there's the quasi-war, but moving into the War of 1812, we'll talk about in detail. There's going to be some issues there as well. So he did not like large standing armies. So and he didn't think that there should be so many jobs in the federal government. So he decreased the size of different departments, eliminating certain positions, especially in the executive. He also persuaded Congress to abolish all internal taxes, leaving customs duties and the sale of Western lands as the only real source of revenue for the government. Now, one of Jefferson's goals was to cut the federal budget and reduce the federal debt. Okay, so Jefferson is not able to eliminate the federal debt, but he is able to essentially cut it in half from $83 million to $45 million. And he does reduce with the approval of Congress, reduces the size of the Army and Navy. The Army was reduced from 4,000 to 2,500 soldiers, and he reduced the Navy from 25 ships to 7 and cut officer and sailor positions accordingly. Now, it is interesting to note that while doing this, at the same time, Jefferson is establishing the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1802. So he gets rid of the excise tax on whiskey with the approval of Congress. And Jefferson, if you will remark that he is a states' rights advocate, he wanted the real authority to remain on at the state level, right? So here's another quote by Jefferson. A noiseless course, not meddling in the affairs of others, is a mark that society is going on in happiness. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretext of taking care of them, they must be happy. Thomas Jefferson. So overall, the president would act moderately. If you look at all of his efforts, he did attempt to abolish the he did not attempt to abolish the Hamiltonian system. All he did was the things I discussed. Now, he did get rid of the excise tax on whiskey, but he does put a Republican spin on a lot of things to do with the Hamiltonian approach. Now, Jefferson hated the Bank of the United States, but he does keep it, right? So that is something interesting to note on. Now, is this, recall back, I want to make some broader points here. Is Jefferson getting elected really the revolution of 1800, as Jefferson calls it, and as scholars have called it repeatedly since? Jefferson came to power in what he called the Second American Revolution, right? So is he writing his own history there, or what? Napoleon was famous for naming all of his battles and things of that nature, like the Battle of the Pyramids actually happened about 5 miles away from the pyramids in a melon patch. So I like remarking on that. But, Thomas Jefferson was pitching him coming to the presidency as the third president of the United States is a revolution for the country. And you'll remark, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, Jefferson's views on revolutions is that we should have one every so often. So the election of 1800 does see the peaceful passage of power from one political party to the other, from the Federalists to the Republicans. But this is the first time that a change in political parties has happened. So there's a lot of uncertainty there going in. Now, Jefferson appoints a lot of his supporters, and through doing this is him doing this is known as patronage. Okay, many Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans are elected to office, and then he uses his appointing powers very effectively as like a political tool and weapon to appoint royal Republicans to numerous positions. And by the time he leaves office, nearly all government jobs are loyal Jeffersonians. Now, patronage, again, is just that act of providing those government jobs to party members and supporters who helped you get there. Now, many Federalist policies remain intact after this so-called revolution of 1800. And throughout and beyond even the Jeffersonian presidency. Okay, so there is no complete repudiation or the Federalist policies still remain in place, right? Many of them. And Jefferson is going to make these decisions to expand the territory of the United States. And many scholars would argue that Jefferson, in doing so, with the Louisiana Purchase, in many ways outdoes the Federalist, right? But yet Jefferson maintains that he shall, by the establishment of Republican principles, sink Federalist principles into an abyss from which there will be no resurrection. So think about he doesn't get rid of the bank. Some Federalist policies still stay in place. And but that's sort of his stance. And then he wants this simple agrarian sort of paradise of yeoman farmers to kind of develop, right? As I'll mention more in a moment, right? So 1801, Jefferson's, he's assuming his residence at the presidential mansion. A bunch of Federalists are leaving Washington. And this is when Jefferson and his party members realize that they are going to continue to be harassed from the Federalist presence within the judicial branch of government. Okay. There is also this issue brewing on the Barbary coast with pirates who are impressing American merchant sailors and enslaving them in North Africa. It's not good. Now, we'll talk about impressment more and more throughout this chapter, and we have talked about it in preceding chapters. This sort of act of kidnapping sailors for different reasons. The British are going to be doing that as well. So as soon as he begins his first term in office, Jefferson will be dealing with the first Barbary War, okay? Also, the details surrounding the Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison, and its landmark decision. We'll be talking about that, okay? Now, Jefferson's going to encounter many situations like the ones I just mentioned in his presidency are going to require him to exercise a fairly strong amount of national authority and interpret the Constitution broadly. The Louisiana Purchase is an example of this. Okay. So let's talk about the Barbary Pirates and the First Barbary War. Okay, the Barbary Pirates and the First Barbary War, a lesser-known conflict in American military history or naval history, but there's going to be some familiarity here that I will mention and kind of tie some things back that I'm sure you have heard of before, but didn't know where it came from. I know that was the case with me. I'm going to tell you a source I have just recently been working with that I think is great. This is it's by Brian Kilmeade and Don Yeager. Let's see. New York's best-selling authors of George Washington's Secret Six. It's an audiobook on Audible that I've been listening to. It's read by Brian Kilmeade. Now, this is called Thomas Jefferson, the Tripoli Pirates, the Forgotten War That Changed American History. It's by Penguin Audio. So, Penguin's a big publisher. Now, great little listen. It's only like 5 hours long or something. And it goes into this topic of the Barbary War and the Barbary Pirates. And there's actually going to be two Barbary Wars, or I wouldn't be referring to it as the first Barbary War. So this conflict lasts from 1801 to 1805. Now, there's an issue that Jefferson encounters with the Barbary Pirates during his time in office, right? The Barbary Pirates are demanding protection money from all nations whose ships sail in the Mediterranean for trade purposes. So the United States crosses the Atlantic and they want to trade with Southern European nations. They're going to go into the Med and they're going to attempt to do that. And if they don't pay tribute to these different Barbary states, they will possibly be the whole crew could possibly be enslaved, right? Impressed. So there are 4 North African states on the Barbary coast, collectively known as the Barbary States. The Barbary States included the 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire, Tripoli, Algiers, and Tunis. And the 4th was an independent sultanate of Morocco. Now, Jefferson had been charting this issue since he became a diplomat in France, and he had considered bringing his daughter, one of his daughters, across the Atlantic. Okay, he was very concerned that this would happen. There's actually a rumor that Benjamin Franklin, on a trip back from Europe, had been abducted by the Barbary Pirates, which was untrue. But there were issues with the Barbary Pirates in the Barbary States for years, right? Preceding the Jefferson administration. Jefferson charted this problem when he was Washington's Secretary of State, as well as throughout Adams' administration. Now, pirates from the Barbary States had been seizing American merchant ships, trying to trade with these southern European nations in the Mediterranean. Ships and their entire crews were kidnapped, enslaved, worked in deplorable positions. There was some mobility for some of the crewmen, particularly the captains, but they were held for ransom, which initially Jefferson would refuse to pay, but goes on to pay later on. Now, the first Barbary War would last the span of Jefferson's first term in office. Adams, during his time in office, had commissioned 6 total frigates to be built, and when Jefferson refused to pay the Bashaw of Tripoli the demanded sum of tribute of $225,000. This would be $3.46 million in 2019 dollars. The Bashaw declared war on the United States on May 10th, 1801. Now, Congress never issued a formal declaration of war in this conflict and allowed Jefferson to have some leeway in instructing commanders of the American vessels. Okay, now if you want to know more in detail about all of that, that book that I suggested a few minutes ago is an excellent source. It really does a great job going into all of the politics and all of the history and all of the dynamics behind this conflict. So the First Barbary War will conclude with this Battle of Derna, which will take place in 1805. Now, this is fought between April and May, and this is when 8 United States Marines and between 400 and 500 Greek, Crete, Arab, and Berbers fight for the Americans as mercenaries and march across the desert from Alexandria, Egypt, and captured the metropolitan city of Derna. So this battle produced a decisive victory for the Americans against a much larger force of 4,000 infantry, as well as cavalry units and 2 artillery pieces. This is the first land battle that the United States fought on foreign soil, and the flag of the United States was raised over Derna following the victory. That is also another first in American history, and first time the American flag had been raised over foreign soil, and produces the lyrics for the Marines' hymn, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles on the land and on the sea." Now, after Derna, on June 5th, 1805, the Bashaw of Tripoli signed a treaty with the United States. Now, Jefferson does agree to pay a ransom of $60,000 for around 300 American prisoners. Now, many argued that buying these American settlers out of slavery was a fair and reasonable compromise to bring an end to the First Barbary War, but some people were very upset about it. Now, by 1807, Algiers, one of these Barbary states, had begun taking American ships yet again and holding American sailors hostage yet again. This would be an issue that would not be able to be dealt with until the United States concludes the War of 1812. This would result in a second conflict known as the Second Barbary War. So, after the conclusion of the Barbary War, I'm going to leap over and do a little backtracking and start with sort of some history of the Supreme Court and the Marshall Court, John Marshall, and the Marbury versus Madison decision. Now, this is all happening during Jefferson's first administration. So, remark, he's from 1801 to 1805, dealt with this issue, and then we'll talk about other issues that were long going, like Marbury v. Madison. Now, a few remarks first on Jefferson's idea of Republican simplicity, right? Thomas Jefferson was a champion, right, for a distinctive type of vision that he had for the United States. His vision differed greatly from the Hamiltonian vision or the Federalist vision. He envisioned this society of yeoman farmers, which were free from industrial towns and city mobs, which he thought that were a plague in Europe. So Jefferson emphasizes this Republican simplicity and localism. But the fact of the reality is during his time in office, cities are growing. Commerce and industrialism are booming and on the rise, and Jefferson's idea of this simple Republican agrarian society is an idea that is really in many ways time. So Jefferson would hold out, though, the territory that he would purchase for the United States in his first term with the Louisiana Purchase would be the saving grace for his simple agrarian republic, right? So I want to get into Marbury v. Madison at this time, okay? Now, first I want to talk about the Marshall Court and introduce some of our players and the main situation at hand here. I've alluded to this a couple of times already in mentioning the judiciary in passing. So the Marshall Court will see the expansion of power of the national government, right? So if we study the history of the Supreme Court, we look at the Marbury v. Madison case during this time period, and we see that the judiciary and the federal government expands its power under the Marshall Court. Now, Supreme Court decisions under Chief Justice John Marshall will show the impact of political party affiliation on the Supreme Court as well. So remark on that. Now, John Marshall will serve is the Supreme Court, Chief Supreme Court Justice for a long time. He will even be around when I start going over Jacksonian democracy in later lectures. Now, the Marshall Court and its decisions really continue to show that the Federalists may be gone from the executive, but they still have a strong presence in the central government, even after the party ceases to be relevant on a national level as a political party. So as Adams loses the executive, he appoints a series of what you would call midnight judges. Midnight judges. Okay, he makes these appointments, and he's leaving office, and he does this in his lame duck period. So Jefferson's already been elected, right? But he doesn't take office until 1801. That's why you always see, like, Jefferson won the election of 1800. His first term was 1801 to 1805, right? So that is how the election cycle runs. So that's what they refer to as the lame duck period, a span of time between when one president is elected, the other takes office. So you see what John Adams is doing here. He's trying to stack the judiciary with his supporters, Federalists. So in the lame duck period, presidents always try and get a lot done in Congress for their party, especially if they lost an election. So this creates problems for the political opposition, and unfortunately for the American people, right? Again, if you have this sort of squabbling, some would argue that these factions produced by this will ultimately produce the best result for the country, and then some would argue that the country's constituents are victims of sort of partisan disputes and petty political squabbling. But in a lame duck session, the outgoing Congress meets and passes laws before the newly elected members of Congress can take their seats. Okay. Now, I want to recall and bring your attention to Article 3, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. It states, "The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish." So there's only one Supreme Court, but Congress has a lot of leeway in determining how many lower courts, how many judges and justices and officials sit on the bench or serve in these courts. This is all set by congressional legislation. So Adams has Congress and his federal supporters in there, and he's making these moves. Okay, so in the Judiciary Act of 1801, 16 new federal circuit judges are appointed, and these judges serve for life, provided they maintain good behavior. And they can receive confirmation from Congress, and they will be Federalists, right? So John Marshall, he is a Federalist who believes in a strong national government. He is opposed to states' rights. He was the Secretary of State for John Adams, and he is the 4th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He serves from 1801 to 1834. Now, I want to remark on this interesting fact is that John Marshall is Thomas Jefferson's cousin, but in no way are they political allies. Marshall is made Chief Justice in one of these midnight appointments, and they're called midnight appointments as they are done minutes to midnight, metaphorically. Now, John Adams is putting these people on the bench so there can be this Federalist legacy in the government, as these judges will serve for life even after his administration has come to an end. So he's literally setting up the situation where this one political party will harass another political party from one branch of government, and the judiciary will be harassing another branch of government, the executive. So the Marbury versus Madison case in 1801. This is going to be what actually establishes the Supreme Court as being something of substance. Now, Alexander Hamilton, if you remember, said the judiciary should be the least threatening of all the branches. And if you also remember that anti-federalists feared that that the judiciary would become too powerful, right? Anti-federalists at this time believed that that a federalist judiciary would strike down state laws. Now, William Marbury, he was a midnight judge, and James Madison is Secretary of State. Now, John Adams and John Marshall didn't give all of the commissions out, okay? They had to be delivered to be official. So James Madison, when he arrives for the Jefferson administration, goes to this desk. He sees this note from John Marshall asking for all of these commissions and appointments for these midnight judges to be delivered. Now, these Federalist judges hated Madison, and he didn't like them either. So he took this to Jefferson, and they decided not to deliver the rest of the appointments and put their own political proponents in office instead. So William Marbury sues, and he got a commission, and sues and says that he got this commission and that it has to be delivered. He asked for a writ of mandamus as per the Judiciary Act of 1789. Okay. Now, Congress said the Supreme Court could issue a writ of mandamus demanding his appointment be made. So, remark on Federalist number 78. This is one that I highlighted in the Constitution New Republic lecture. The judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. Okay, that is what the Federalist number 78 states. So Chief Justice John Marshall, he has a dilemma here. Okay, he is going to, he could tell James Madison what to do. But then he could risk James Madison say, hey, make me do that. So this would essentially pit this executive Democratic Republican branch of government under Jefferson against a Federalist faction trying to take control of the judiciary. Now, Marshall's decision is as follows. Okay, he declares the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. The Supreme Court stated that Marbury was entitled to be a judge, but that they could not enforce the law. So that it was against the balance of powers, therefore void. Okay, so this established a very important tradition known as the tradition of judicial review. Now, Marshall says that, quote, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. The judiciary deserves the right to look at laws, examine them when brought before them, and determine if they are constitutional. Marshall says the Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional. In this case, it is a federal law that was passed by Congress. Okay, so let's compare and contrast in a little bit of review capacity Marshall and Jefferson. Okay, so remember, John Marshall's a Federalist, Thomas Jefferson's a Republican. All right. Now, on the issue of federalism, Marshall favors a strong central government, and Jefferson favors state rights. Marshall would oppose state rights. On strict versus loose construction in their interpretation of the Constitution, Marshall is loose, Jefferson is strict. Or is he? We'll keep remarking on that. And when it comes to the national bank, okay, Marshall says it's constitutional. Jefferson says it's not, but he keeps it anyway. And when it comes to the favored economic pursuit, Federalist, John Marshall, they say commerce, right? Jefferson says agriculture. And when it comes to who interprets the Constitution, well, if you looked at Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall would say the Supreme Court. And Jefferson would contend, however, if you remarked on the Kentucky resolution, that states should determine how the Constitution is interpreted. So in conclusion, Marbury versus Madison Chief Justice John Marshall firstly held that Madison's refusal to deliver Marbury's commission was illegal, and secondly, that it was normally proper for a court in such situations to order a government official in question to deliver the commission. The court did not order Madison to comply, however. Examining the law Congress had passed that gave the Supreme Court jurisdiction over types of cases like Marbury's, Marshall found that it expanded the definition of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction beyond what was originally set down in the Constitution. So, Marshall then struck down the law, announcing that American courts have the power to invalidate laws that they found in violation of the principles of the Constitution. So this means this meant that the court had no jurisdiction over the case, and it could not issue the writ that Marbury requested. But the judicial branch gains this power. So in Jefferson refusing to, this is the big takeaway for me, in Jefferson refusing to appoint Marbury, the judicial branch becomes more powerful under Supreme Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, Marshall was an important key judge as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He helped increase the power of the federal government. One other issue here on the Supreme Court was with Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase is a justice on the Supreme Court who was impeached. He had charges brought against him because he was a Federalist, right? Jeffersonians believed Chase was too partisan in his views, and he was impeached, but he was not removed from office. And after his impeachment, impeachment would not be used regularly because a government official was not liked, but would rather be saved for when the law was broken. So that is another issue that comes up later on. Now, let's see here. Looks like I'm trying to see when Samuel Chase was impeached. It's in our textbook, and it was after the Marbury versus Madison case. So what we're going to be getting into next topically is the Louisiana Purchase and the doubling of the national domain, and the following Lewis and Clark expedition, and the explorations of Zebulon Pike. So going to be doing that in a separate recording. So you can tune back in for that. Be sure that you are watching the documentaries I provided in relation to these topics, as well as reading along in your textbook. And I will talk to you guys very soon. Thank you.